The alien overlords spoke with cold arrogance, their demand simple and absolute, a testament to their belief that humanity was no more than an inconvenience. Among those who heard the message was Sergeant Carl Simpson, standing amidst the chaos on the outskirts of Chicago, a U.S. Army Ranger and veteran of countless battles. He had faced death before, but nothing like this. The Zalvar were unlike any enemy humanity had known, their soldiers towering beasts clad in impenetrable armor, wielding weapons that vaporized flesh on contact. Even the most advanced human technology crumbled before them. Yet, Carl's resolve burned hotter than the fires that consumed the city skyline. The evacuation was chaos, desperate civilians scrambling to escape the relentless assault. Carl and his squad had been tasked with holding a critical defensive line to allow refugees time to flee. They'd held longer than anyone had thought possible, but at a cost. Now, only a handful of soldiers remained with Carl, their numbers dwindling with each clash. When the Zalvar broadcasted their ultimatum, complete surrender or annihilation, Carl's commander had ordered a counterattack. It was suicidal, but retreat wasn't an option. Carl knew better than most what surrender would mean. The Zalvar had made examples of other civilizations in their expansion across the galaxy, leaving behind only ruins and servitude. Humanity would be no different. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the thick smoke that blanketed the battlefield as Carl crouched in the rubble, scanning the horizon through his scope. His squad waited silently, their faces hardened by exhaustion and grief. Beside him, Corporal Jensen whispered, "Think they'll ever run out of soldiers?" Carl didn't look away from the scope. "If they do, we'll make sure they remember us before they're gone." Jensen smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. The squad was a patchwork of survivors from different units, bonded only by their shared determination to fight to the bitter end. Each of them had lost friends, family, and homes. Now, their purpose was singular: to ensure humanity had a chance, no matter how slim. The attack came without warning. A screeching sound ripped through the air as alien artillery decimated their position. Carl barked orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. The Zalvar foot soldiers emerged through the smoke like specters, their glowing eyes fixed on the human defenders. Carl's squad opened fire, bullets ricocheting uselessly off the aliens' armor. It was a slaughter. Carl fought like a man possessed, his every move precise and calculated. He used every ounce of his training, exploiting the few vulnerabilities he'd learned about the Zalvar over weeks of brutal combat. A lucky shot disabled one alien's weapon, allowing Carl to take it down with a knife. But the tide was insurmountable. One by one, his squad fell, their cries of pain and defiance swallowed by the unrelenting cacophony of war. By the time the dust settled, Carl was alone. Blood streaked his face, his uniform torn and stained. Around him lay the bodies of his comrades and the mangled remains of the Zalvar he'd managed to kill. He dropped to his knees, exhaustion and despair threatening to consume him. The aliens were unstoppable. Every death felt meaningless, a drop of water in an endless ocean. Then, amidst the silence, Carl's radio crackled to life. It was a general broadcast, the voice of the Zalvar king himself. His words were sharp and cruel, delivered in a tone of absolute superiority. "Your resistance is admirable, but futile. Humanity's time in the cosmos has ended. I, King Maldrex, shall personally oversee your final moments. Know that your deaths are a mercy." Carl clenched his fists, the king's voice igniting a fury within him. This was no battle for survival anymore. It was personal. The Zalvar had taken everything from him: his squad, his friends, his world. If this king wanted to see humanity's end firsthand, Carl would make sure it wasn't the end he expected. He stood, forcing himself to move despite the pain in his body. Around him, the ruins of the city were eerily quiet, the fires casting long shadows. In the distance, the Zalvar's colossal flagship loomed over the horizon, a symbol of their dominance. Carl's eyes narrowed. If humanity had one chance left, it was him. alone, battered, but unbroken. As he scavenged supplies from the fallen, Carl's thoughts turned to his training, to the lessons drilled into him during years of service. He remembered his instructor's words: adapt, improvise, overcome. It had been a mantra in the Rangers, a guiding principle that separated the living from the dead. Carl had no illusions about his odds, but he didn't need to win a war. He needed to make a statement. He activated his radio, cycling through frequencies until he found a secure military channel. Static greeted him, followed by a familiar voice, a surviving general organizing the remnants of Earth's forces. Carl relayed his plan in clipped, determined tones. The king was the linchpin. Take him out, and the Zalvar might falter long enough for humanity to regroup. You're insane, Sergeant, the general replied. But if anyone can pull it off, it's you. We'll do what we can to buy you time. Carl grunted in acknowledgement. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. As he prepared to move, he allowed himself one final glance at the bodies of his squad. He whispered their names, a silent promise that their sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. The Zalvar wanted humanity to surrender, to roll over and accept extinction. Carl Simpson wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. As he set off toward the alien flagship, a grim determination settled over him. The king thought he was untouchable, that his war was already won. Carl intended to prove him wrong. The night was a shroud of smoke and shadow as Carl Simpson approached the looming silhouette of the Zalvar flagship. The massive vessel anchored itself over the ruins of Earth's largest cities, like a dark god presiding over its conquered domain. Its hull glimmered faintly, a mix of alien alloys that seemed alive, pulsating with energy. Carl crouched in the rubble of a fallen skyscraper, his every muscle tense as he surveyed the patrols. The Zalvar soldiers moved with a mechanical precision, their movements calculated and cold. He would have to be perfect, one mistake, and it would all end here. Carl's plan was audacious. He knew it, but audacity was all that remained. The Zalvar command structure revolved entirely around their king, and Carl intended to exploit that singular arrogance. With the human military scattered and disorganized, any counteroffensive would have to be precise and crippling. His target was the king himself, a figure whose death could break the enemy's morale and buy Earth precious time. Alone, battered, and armed with nothing but scavenged gear and grit, Carl had become humanity's last offensive. His first obstacle was a patrol. Zalvar soldiers guarded the entrance to an alien stronghold nestled in the shadow of the flagship. This was where the king's personal guards were stationed, where every security measure would be at its most unforgiving. Carl steadied his breathing, his eyes scanning the alien movements. The soldiers spoke in a guttural, rhythmic language, their voices a low growl that made the hair on his neck rise. He couldn't fight them head-on. That had been the first lesson of this war. Humanity's weapons were laughably inadequate against the Zalvar's armor. But stealth, creativity, and sheer human stubbornness had proven to be their only equalizer. Carl slipped into the darkness, moving with the silence of a predator. He used the rubble and twisted metal to his advantage, slipping past the guards and into the compound. The air inside was cold and sterile, the corridors illuminated by faint, bioluminescent veins running along the walls. Every step felt like walking on the edge of a knife, but Carl's mind was calm, his focus unshakable. Each breath was measured, each movement deliberate. He wasn't just a soldier now. He was the culmination of humanity's fight for survival, distilled into a single, unyielding purpose. As he moved deeper into the alien structure, he found what he was looking for, an access panel, glowing faintly with alien script. He knelt beside it, his fingers working swiftly to attach a small device he'd salvaged earlier, a military hacking tool designed for breaching human systems. Whether it would work on alien technology was a gamble, but he had no choice. The seconds stretched into eternity as the device blinked, its screen cycling through unreadable symbols. Then, with a faint click, the panel shifted, revealing a hidden passage. Beyond the panel was a room unlike anything Carl had seen before. The walls pulsed with a rhythmic glow, and the air hummed with energy. In the center was a console, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light. This was it, the central nerve of the king's command. If he could disable the defenses here, the flagship's lower decks would be vulnerable to attack. Carl moved quickly, his hands deftly navigating the alien interface. It was a puzzle, a challenge that demanded every ounce of his focus and adaptability. A sound behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly, his heart hammering as a towering Zalvar soldier stepped into the room. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then it lunged. Carl rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the soldier's massive blade as it sliced through the air. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had no time for a prolonged fight. The console was already in the process of disabling the defenses, but the sequence wasn't complete. He needed to hold his ground. Gripping a combat knife in one hand and a stolen Zalvar pistol in the other, Carl faced the alien with a grim determination. The fight was brutal, a clash of desperation and raw power. The Zalvar was faster and stronger, its every strike capable of shattering bone. But Carl was relentless, using the confined space to his advantage. He ducked and weaved, landing precise blows that chipped away at the alien's defenses. The pistol's energy blast barely slowed it down, but Carl wasn't aiming to kill. He was buying time. Finally, with a calculated feint, he lured the alien into overextending, plunging his knife into a weak spot beneath its arm. The soldier let out a guttural roar before collapsing, its lifeless body hitting the ground with a thud. Carl didn't waste a second. He turned back to the console, finishing the sequence just as alarms began to blare throughout the compound. The defenses were down, but the entire facility would be swarming with Zalvar in moments. He grabbed what he could from the room, a data module containing intel he hoped would be useful, and made his escape. The corridors were a maze of chaos as Carl moved with calculated urgency. Alien soldiers poured into the halls, their guttural commands echoing like a drumbeat of doom. Carl's every instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't afford to be reckless. He used the confusion to his advantage, slipping past patrols and taking out isolated enemies with ruthless efficiency. Every kill was a reminder of what was at stake, of the line he walked between survival and sacrifice. Outside the compound, the night was alive with fire. The remnants of Earth's military had launched their diversionary assault, drawing the Zalvar's attention away from Carl's mission. Explosions lit up the horizon, and the air was thick with the smell of burning metal and ozone. Carl activated his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. "This is Simpson. Defenses are down. You've got an opening. Make it count." The reply came quickly, the voice of a surviving general crackling through the static. "Roger that, Sergeant. Godspeed." Carl didn't respond. His focus was already on the next step. The flagship loomed ahead, its presence a constant reminder of the king's arrogance. With the compound's defenses down, the lower decks would be accessible, but only for a short window. Carl steeled himself, his grip tightening on his weapons. The Zalvar had underestimated humanity before, and he intended to make them regret it. As he moved toward the flagship, the battlefield around him seemed to blur. The explosions, the screams, the relentless march of alien forces, all of it faded into the background. Carl's world narrowed to a single purpose: reaching the king. Every step was a defiance, every breath a declaration that humanity was not finished. The flagship's hull was close now, its surface a lattice of alien technology. Carl found an access point, a small maintenance hatch he'd seen during his reconnaissance. It wasn't guarded. The Zalvar likely didn't consider it a vulnerability. They hadn't accounted for someone like him. As he climbed into the darkness of the ship, Carl allowed himself one fleeting thought of his fallen comrades. Their faces flashed in his mind, a silent reminder of what he was fighting for. He whispered their names under his breath, a vow and a prayer. The king awaited him. Carl was ready. The throne room of the Zalvar king was a stark contrast to the cold sterility of the rest of the flagship. It was a place of grandeur and menace, its walls adorned with the spoils of countless conquests. The shimmering trophies of defeated civilizations glowed faintly in the low light, a silent testament to the king's dominion over the galaxy. At its center sat King Maldrex himself, a towering figure clad in an ornate armor that radiated power and authority. His eyes, a smoldering red, glared down from the high throne, piercing and merciless. Carl Simpson emerged from the shadows, his breath steady but his pulse pounding in his ears. Every step he took toward the king felt heavier, the weight of humanity's survival pressing down on his shoulders. The room was eerily silent save for the faint hum of the ship's core, a sound that seemed to echo the tension between predator and prey. "You are bold to come here, human," Maldrex rumbled, his voice deep and resonant. It carried the weight of centuries, a voice accustomed to command and unquestioning obedience. But boldness without strength is nothing but foolishness. Carl stopped a few feet from the throne, his eyes locked on the king. He felt the rage simmering beneath his calm exterior, a fire stoked by the faces of his fallen comrades and the memories of cities burned to ash. He raised his chin, his voice cold and steady. "Boldness is all we've got left. But I'm not here to talk about strength. I'm here to end you." The king's laughter was a low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together. He stood, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to envelop the room. His armor shifted with him, its intricate designs glowing faintly as if alive. "Do you think you're the first to challenge me? I have crushed countless worlds, slain the greatest warriors of entire species. You are nothing." Carl didn't flinch. He was already calculating, assessing the king's size, his movements, the armor that covered him. He knew this wouldn't be a conventional fight. Maldrex was stronger, faster, and protected by technology far beyond human comprehension. But Carl had one advantage. He was unpredictable, a soldier honed by desperation and an unwillingness to quit. Maldrex moved first, a blur of speed that belied his massive frame. His blade, an enormous weapon that pulsed with energy, came down in a devastating arc Carl dubbed to the side, the blade carving through the floor where he'd stood moments before. He rolled to his feet, his own blade, a human combat knife dwarfed by the king's weapon, gripped tightly in one hand, a stolen Zalvar pistol in the other. The fight was a brutal dance of survival. Carl dodged and weaved, using the king's size against him, staying just out of reach while looking for an opening. Maldrex's strikes were precise and relentless, each one capable of cleaving a man in half. But Carl didn't falter. He fired the alien pistol, the energy blast ricocheting off the king's armor harmlessly, but it wasn't about damage. He was testing, probing for a weakness. "You fight well for an insect," Maldrex sneered, his movements fluid and unhurried. "But your efforts are meaningless. You cannot win." Carl didn't respond. Words were wasted on men like Maldrex. Instead, he used the environment to his advantage, drawing the king into tight spaces where his massive weapon was harder to wield. The throne room became a battlefield, the walls scorched and shattered by the ferocity of their clash. Carl's body screamed with exhaustion, but his mind remained razor-sharp. Every breath was a calculation, every movement a strategy. Finally, he saw it. A chink in the king's armor, a small gap near the base of his neck where the glowing energy veins converged. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Carl feinted to the left, drawing the king's attention, then pivoted sharply, driving his knife toward the vulnerable spot. The blade found its mark, sinking into the flesh beneath the armor. Maldrex roared, the sound a mixture of pain and fury. His hand lashed out, catching Carl and throwing him across the room. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs, but he forced himself to move, rolling to avoid the king's next strike. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but he didn't stop. Pain was irrelevant. "You dare wound me?" Maldrex bellowed, his voice shaking the room. His movements were more erratic now, driven by anger. It was what Karl had hoped for. The king charged, his blade raised high, but Karl was ready. He threw a small explosive charge, one of the last pieces of human tech he had left, at the king's feet. The detonation wasn't enough to kill him, but it staggered him, giving Karl the opening he needed. He surged forward, his movements a blur of precision and desperation, driving his knife into the exposed gap once more. Maldrex collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. For the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of disbelief that a human, a mere soldier, had brought him low. Karl stood over him, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his resolve unbroken. "You will gain nothing from this," the king growled, his voice weakened but defiant. "My people will avenge me. They will burn your world until nothing remains." Karl crouched, his face inches from the king's. "Maybe, but they'll remember this. They'll remember you were beaten by one of us." With a final, brutal motion, Karl ended the king's life. The room fell silent, the hum of the ship's core now a quiet backdrop to the aftermath. Karl stood, his breathing heavy, his mind numb. The weight of what he'd done and what it had cost settled over him like a shroud. The fight was over, but the war was not. As he dragged the king's lifeless body toward the ship's central chamber, he activated the broadcast systems, ensuring every Zalvar on the planet would see what had transpired. The image of their fallen leader would spread through their ranks like wildfire, sowing confusion and fear. Karl knew this victory was temporary. The Zalvar were still out there, their fleet still a threat. But for the first time, humanity had struck a blow that would echo across the stars. As he stepped into the darkness of the ship, the king's lifeless form in tow, he allowed himself a brief, grim smile. This was far from over, but for now, humanity had something it hadn't felt in far too long. Hope. The Zalvar flagship hung in the sky like a wounded beast, its once imposing presence now dimmed. Fires flickered across its surface, scars from the desperate human assault that had bought Karl Simpson the chance to strike at its heart. Inside, the corridors were eerily silent. The hum of alien machinery was subdued, the faint sound of distant alarms the only reminder of the chaos that had unfolded within. Karl moved through the ship with slow, deliberate steps, the lifeless body of King Maldrex dragging behind him, its weight a grim testament to what had been won and what had been lost. Karl's body ached with every movement, a symphony of pain from wounds both fresh and old. His blood stained the floor in sporadic droplets, mixing with the dark, viscous fluid seeping from the king's wounds. The struggle had pushed him to the brink, and he was running on fumes now, his every step driven by sheer willpower. But there was no time to stop. He had a message to deliver, one that could not be ignored. He reached the heart of the ship, a cavernous chamber dominated by a massive holographic display that flickered and shifted with alien symbols. This was the nerve center of the flagship, a place from which entire planets had been conquered and subjugated. Now, it would serve a different purpose. Karl heaved the king's body onto the central platform, letting it slump there like a broken idol. He activated the broadcast systems, his fingers moving with a mechanical precision. The hologram flared to life, its image broadcasting to every Zalvar ship, every soldier, and every surviving corner of Earth. "Look at him," Karl said, his voice hoarse but steady. He gestured to the fallen king, his tone cold and unyielding. "This is your leader, the one who promised you victory, the one who said humanity would fall without a fight." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of defiance and grief. Across the planet and beyond, Zalvar soldiers paused, their advance faltering as the image of their dead king filled their screens. It was a blow that no weapon could deliver, a fracture in their unity, their belief in their own invincibility. Karl stared into the camera, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "We may be broken, battered, and bleeding, but we are not finished. If you want to take what's left of our world, come and try. We'll fight you for every inch. And just like your king, You'll bleed for it. He ended the transmission, letting the silence fill the room once more. The effort left him drained, his legs nearly giving out as he slumped against the console. He closed his eyes for a moment, the adrenaline fading and the weight of everything he'd endured settling over him like a lead blanket. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Carl's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. A figure emerged from the shadows, a human soldier, bloodied but alive. It was Corporal Jensen, one of the few survivors of the diversionary assault. Behind him, a handful of others followed, their faces grim but alight with cautious hope. "We saw the broadcast," Jensen said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it. You killed the bastard." Carl nodded, too tired to speak. Jensen and the others approached the platform, their eyes lingering on the king's lifeless form. There was a moment of silence, a shared acknowledgement of what this victory meant, and what it had cost. "The Zalvar are retreating," Jensen continued, his tone softer now. "Not all of them, but enough. They're pulling back to regroup. Whatever you did, it's working." Carl let out a slow breath, a flicker of relief cutting through his exhaustion. The retreat wouldn't last forever, he knew that. The Zalvar were too vast, too relentless to be stopped by a single act. But it was a start, a crack in their facade of invincibility, a moment for humanity to regroup and rebuild. "What's left of command is organizing an evacuation," Jensen added. "They want you to come back with us." Carl shook his head. "Not yet. There's more to do." Jensen frowned but didn't argue. He knew better than to try. Instead, he extended a hand, helping Carl to his feet. Together, they walked through the corridors, the faint echoes of their footsteps a reminder of the emptiness the Zalvar had left in their wake. Outside, the sky was a canvas of fire and smoke, the remnants of battle painting the horizon. The Zalvar flagship still loomed overhead, but its lights were dim, its presence no longer a symbol of dominance but of defiance. Human forces moved through the battlefield below, scavenging what they could, helping the wounded and gathering the dead. It was a somber scene, but it was also a testament to survival. Carl stood on the edge of the battlefield, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. Somewhere out there, the Zalvar were regrouping, planning their next move. The war was far from over, but for the first time, humanity had a fighting chance. They had shown the galaxy that they wouldn't go quietly, that they would fight for every breath, every inch of their existence. Jensen stepped beside him, his expression thoughtful. "You think they'll come back?" Carl didn't answer immediately. He knew the answer, but it didn't need to be said. Instead, he turned to Jensen, his voice steady despite the weariness in his body. "When they do, we'll be ready." The two men stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. Around them, the remnants of humanity worked tirelessly, their resolve unbroken. They were battered, bloodied, and scarred, but they were still here. And as long as they drew breath, the fight would continue. Carl turned away from the battlefield, his step steady as he moved toward the next challenge. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing with certainty: humanity would endure.